you ever encountered an ordinary place that seemed to possess an air of fantasy? Somewhere that, when caught in the right light, filled you with a sudden sense of wonder? I was on a train to Victoria Station in downtown London, finally in the UK after a stressful day of travel mishaps. As the train rolled through the English suburbs, I leaned against the window and happened upon a place that appeared fantastical, so much so that it erased all stress and reminded me how excited I was to be in the UK for the first time. It's not that the view was aesthetically impressive, it was a rather ordinary landscape. Something like this. Deep green grass and terraced brick houses bathed in grey from the clouded sky. It was plain, but something about it seemed rich with fantastical potential. My question is, why? I've had this feeling many times before. It happens when I view high school football fields with expansive bleachers, county fairs at dusk, city skyscrapers glinting in the sunlight, shadowy forests, and wide suburban streets, to name a few. Why do I feel these relatively mundane places are fantastical? Hint, hint, these snapshots come from movies. The films we watch, or more generally the stories we consume, can impart on us romanticized feelings toward the places in which they are set. It's as if our minds cling to the setting as the site of the story magic, and thereby associate that setting with fantasy. The more stories we consume with the same setting, the more our minds solidify that fantastical association. So when we visit a place of similar appearance in the real world, if we catch it in the right light and in the right mood, our minds project the fantasy onto it, giving us a brief feeling of excitement and possibility. But stories aren't the sole cause of this phenomenon. Other sources of fantasy, namely nostalgia, aspirations, and societal narratives, can contribute by painting certain places in an idyllic light. Nostalgia, with its rose-colored lens, builds up places from our past to be fantastical. For instance, I have fond memories of library visits and autumn jogs. My mind has created a romanticized picture of these blissful spaces, so when I see a tall wall of books or a leafy yellow wood, I often feel a flicker of magic. Aspiration in this context refers to a yearning for a certain place. For example, I like the idea of someday visiting Hawaii or living somewhere with a roof deck. Bougie, I know. Some aspirations are the product of social conditioning, like how I find myself longing for a spacious modern kitchen in the suburbs. Still quite bougie. These aspirations are essentially dream fantasies, and when we encounter these places, our minds may conjure up the accompanying sense of wonder. Prevailing societal narratives are ways that a society frames certain places. Sometimes the framing is utopic and results in fantasy. Such narratives may be rooted in history, like how we glorify colonial New England as the quaint bedrock of our nation, or the 1950s as a prosperous family-oriented time. Or they may be rooted in cultural perceptions, like how we view Paris as the city of love, the rural South as charming, or college as the best years of your life. The tourism and marketing industries often play up these fantastical narratives. Of course, all of these sources tend to be problematic in their one-sided glorification of places, which tends to be tied up in status quo power relations. For example, while New England's colonial history is quaint, it's also characterized by tough living conditions, abuses against Native Americans, and strict Puritan moralism. But that's the thing about any place-based fantasy. The magic lies in its oversimplification of our very messy reality. Now, these sources often overlap and influence one another, like how stories can shape societal narratives and vice versa, and all may inform the fantasy surrounding a particular place. So, which factor into the view from the London-bound train? I'd never been to the UK, so I had no direct nostalgia. I did aspire to someday visit Ireland with its green hills, and London with its historical architecture, so maybe my mind was drawing on those fantasies in part. And I suppose there is a not-so-ubiquitous but still existent narrative in the US where I'm from about the hominess and sophistication of the British countryside. You know, cottages, farms, origins of capitalism, the pastoral homeland of an imperial empire. We love that stuff in the States. So these sources likely contributed a bit to the fantasy I felt on the train. But in recalling the view, I can't deny that the flicker of fantasy I felt was underscored by a distinct sensation. I felt like I was looking at a site where stories take place. I felt an excitement for the possibility that story world and the real world might be the same, that story magic might exist for real. So the fantasy in this snapshot, and I knew this subconsciously as my head rested against the train window, comes predominantly from stories. So, how? How were stories successful in getting my mind to associate the British countryside with such a potent sense of fantasy? Well, I think there are two reasons. First, there's a lot of them. As I mentioned, exposure to more stories with the same setting often results in a stronger fantastical association with that setting. Of course, one story that really sticks with you can accomplish the same thing. It's quantity or quality. Let's look just at the movies that stand out to me with this setting. And yes, animated films count, perhaps more so because the magic of their imaginative, fabricated worlds is easy to grasp. We have Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, 101 Dalmatians, The Sword and the Stone, Mary Poppins, Oliver, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, Robin Hood, A Christmas Carol, Nanny McPhee, The Chronicles of Narnia, The Water Horse, Legend of the Deep, a bonus Alice in Wonderland, and, of course, Harry Potter. And yes, Lord of the Rings should be on here, but I've only seen one. Now note that these films have different settings from one another. Some are set in early London, some in pastoral Britain, some in old mansions, some on Privet Drive, but they share a commonality. All of their settings are reminiscent of a bygone British era, and that is enough to connect them to this snapshot, which I perceive as the embodiment of a simple British past. The films share something else in common. All are adapted from British children's novels. We have Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, Peter and Wendy by J.M. Barrie, The 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith, The Sword and the Stone by T.H. White, the Mary Poppins series by P.L. Travers, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, The Magical Bedknob and Bonfires and Broomsticks by Mary Norton, oops, not Robin Hood, that's based on British legend, A Christmas Carol in Prose by Charles Dickens, Nurse Matilda by Christiana Brand, The Chronicles of Narnia series by C.S. Lewis, The Water Horse by Dick King Smith, and, you know these, the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling. While we're at it, let's add to the mix a few other British children's books that connect to the setting in question. The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter, A Bear Called Paddington by Michael Bond, and The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. So, no offense Brits, but why was British children's literature the basis for so many stories I was exposed to growing up in the US? Well, it's because they're fantastical. They're literally of the fantasy genre. And this is the second reason why the sense of fantasy I felt in rural suburban Britain was so strong. Of course, any story can leave a fantastical impression because, quote, all writing is fantasy to some extent. Even realism is a constructed and imagined representation of reality, not reality per se, end quote. Still, stories of the fantasy genre possess a more palpable magic, and British authors are very good at the fantasy genre. The films and books I've mentioned have ghosts, lake monsters, fairies, sorcery, grinning cats, flying nannies, flying cars, flying immortal children, talking animals of all sorts, and the most delicious, fantastical sweets. Did anyone else think this looked like just the pinnacle of confection? And sure, much of this magic takes place away from the British countryside. Narnia, Hogwarts, Wonderland, Neverland, Mordor, I think it's called. Sorry guys, I really haven't seen these. But in my mind, Britain is still connected to the existence of these fantastical realms. There are reasons why British stories tend to be fantastical. An article by Colleen Gillard in The Atlantic titled Why the British Tell Better Children's Stories explains many of them through a comparison with American stories. Here are the three main takeaways. Landscape. Britain is charming. It has rolling green hills and is often nestled under a soft gray blanket of clouds. America has harsher, mountainous terrain and sweeping scenic views. Gillard puts it succinctly. Britain's antique countryside, strewn with moldering castles and cozy farms, lends itself to fairy tale invention. America's mighty vistas, by contrast, are less cozy, less human-scaled, and less haunted. Further, Americans historically viewed their land as something to leverage for financial gain. Or for survival. I mean, frontier life was rough. But this pragmatic, capitalistic view doesn't quite lend itself to fairy tale invention. Religious influence. Hey, look who's back! It's those persistent Puritans. America's founders were staunchly moralistic and hardworking, and that legacy carries over into American children's stories, which tend to be didactic and grounded in reality. We have frontier stories like the Little House series, historical stories like Johnny Tremain, social commentaries like Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and work hard stories like The Little Engine That Could. All are works of realism or blatantly lesson driven. Sure, we have fantasy stories, The Wizard of Oz an important one, but even in that story, well, the film version, the fantasy is given a rational explanation. Dorothy might have dreamed it. On the other hand, the UK, especially Scotland, held out against Christian influence for longer than other European nations, allowing pagan religions to maintain their cultural hold. The island therefore has a more rooted tradition of enchanted spiritualism, such as that of Celtic mythology. Hey, speaking of mythology, mythic tradition. In addition to Celtic myths, Britain also has the legends of King Arthur and Robin Hood, lofty medieval tales of glory, sorcery, and trickery that have influenced the island's storytelling for centuries. Meanwhile, Gillard writes, America is peculiar in its lack of indigenous folklore. Though it's not that peculiar when you look at how this country treats indigenous and African peoples, groups whose rich oral traditions were actively erased. And what folktales do we have? Surprise, surprise, they glorify hard work and manifest destiny, such as the tales of John Henry the railroad worker, Paul Bunyan the lumberjack, and frontiersmen Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. So these three UK versus US differences should give you a sense of why Britain is better primed to produce fantastical works of children's literature. It's almost no surprise that two British authors, Lewis Carroll with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and J.M. Barrie with Peter and Wendy, were instrumental in shifting children's literature from educational to imaginative. It's important to note here that we don't just cling to these British fantasy stories because they're magical and cool. There's something else about the fantasy genre that is appealing, especially for kids. Gillard summarizes, it turns out that fantasy, the established domain of British children's literature, is critical to childhood development. We cling to fantasy because it helps us make sense of our world indirectly, through metaphors and allegories. Fantasy gives us distant, imaginary spaces where we can escape our reality, but simultaneously work through and understand its difficulties. And, is this a Lord of the Rings picture? Wow. No, yeah, I love Frodo. So it's for these two reasons, the quantity of renowned British stories and their fantasticalness, that the humble view from my train window on the way to Victoria Station felt full of magical potential. At least for me. Noticing these types of moments is important because they point to preconceived notions in our minds about specific places. This is by no means bad, as it lets us experience a taste of magic in the real world. But there could be a greater psychological impact here that affects how we interact with places and the people who inhabit them. As scholar Tony Watkins claims, stories contribute to the formation of the cultural imagination, a network of patterns and templates through which we articulate our experience. If our worldview is going to be influenced by fantasies that, as I mentioned, are reductive and potentially out of touch, we should be aware of it. I think you can pretty easily search your mind and identify places that you view in a romanticized way. Try it, because as Watkins also states, it is a truth not universally acknowledged that we live by fiction rather than by fact. And while I'm all for living by fiction, we must do so responsibly. There's a lot more to dig into here, like the broader history of children's literature and the psychology of the fantasy genre, but I hope this has sparked some initial curiosity and reflection. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon with another video.